Mansfield College. My name's Helen Mountfield, I'm the principal. It's wonderful on such a sunny evening to see so many people who care enough about knowledge and maybe have heard of Richard Ovenden and his fantastic book, Burning the Books, to want to show up and hear this talk. This is our annual Milton Lecture, and the Milton Lecture is Mansfield's annual lecture named for John Milton, and it was named for Milton at the request of the late Charles Brock, who was the former chaplain of Mansfield and is a Bancroft Fellow of the college, in recognition of his generous philanthropic support of the college over many years. We've held the Milton Lecture for a number of years, but this is only the second Milton Lecture since Charles's death in November 2023. And often he would travel over specially for this event from his home in the United States. So we miss him today, and we send our thoughts and good wishes to his widow, Mary Lincoln, and to all of Charles's family and friends. Charles held many roles at Mansfield. He was a postgraduate student here, then chaplain, a theology fellow, director of ministerial education, member of the College Finance Committee, SCR steward. He's a Bancroft Fellow, and no doubt many other unrecorded roles. And Charles and his late wife Carolyn, who was for many years the director of music and the director of the Mansfield Choir, were a central part of the college's life. And he succeeded in bringing people together to bring the change of status from a permanent private hall to a college, and steered the college through a potentially difficult point in its history, which maybe was one of the reasons he liked Milton so much, or I think it was mostly that he thought his ideas about theology and politics were very interesting. He was a passionate advocate of John Milton, and that's why we hold this annual lecture, and our politics fellowship, held by Professor David Leopold, who is currently on sabbatical, is our John Milton Fellow. Charles viewed Milton as an extraordinary poet, an august revolutionary, a far-reaching social thinker, a subtle theologian, and a groundbreaking political theorist and activist. And he drew parallels between Milton's interest in social reform and justice and Mansfield's establishment as Oxford's first dissenting college. And he would always remind us that Milton looks down on us every day. His statue, as described by Charles, soaring above the quad, although I have to confess it's quite a small statue, and it took me quite a long time to notice it was there. It was Charles who pointed it out to me. He himself gave the Milton Lecture on not one but two occasions, and we've had many other distinguished speakers over the years, including recently the feminist cultural historian Dr. Anna Beer, Dr. Tristram Hunt, the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Professor Joe Mashenka, a Milton expert from University College here in Oxford, and the specialist Renaissance literature scholar Dr. Margaret Keane. But tonight's speaker is one who I'm sure Milton himself would have felt was a worthy speaker, as the author of Areopagitica. Richard needs no introduction in Oxford. He is our own national treasure, the keeper of the Bodleian Library, and the head of the best-named department in Oxford, GLAM, which is the Gardens, Libraries and Museums Department. And he is also the acclaimed author of Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack, which is particularly timely. So it's with much pleasure that I invite Richard Ovenden OBE to give the 2025 Milton Lecture. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, Helen, and it's so nice to be here with you all this evening. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to give this lecture. It's a great honour to be with you this evening. So my talk this evening is divided into two halves. The first half will be really based on the book which Helen referred to, which I published in 2020, and to give a kind of historical view of how knowledge has been attacked, particularly knowledge held in the institutions that society has created to preserve it, particularly libraries and archives. And then the second half of the talk is about the current situation, really the situation since I published the book, which was in September 2020. And so bringing us kind of right up to date, I hope, with the realm of knowledge, the way in which those institutions, particularly libraries and archives, not exclusively, are being threatened, the role that they play for society in preserving knowledge, and I hope that this is not going to be too depressing a talk, because what I want to highlight throughout it all, and please bear this in mind, is that the preservation of knowledge is a useful thing for society, and the way in which librarians and archivists are responding to the challenges, I think, shows that society retains almost a kind of genetic desire to preserve knowledge and to share it and to pass it on. And I see that all the time, including in what is happening at the moment. But let us go into the talk itself. And I think one of the overriding messages comes to you from Jacques Derrida. And I want you to kind of hold on to this idea that, because, you know, there is a tendency, if you walk around the Bodleian, you look at these beautiful rooms, the beautiful historic buildings, the astonishing collections that we have, the treasures. You can see this wonderful autographed manuscript by J.S. Bach on show, and you think, you know, these are wonderful organisations. But the knowledge, that preservation of knowledge, is something which has been a source of contention and control, particularly from authoritarian regimes over millennia. So this is not this is not something that is about the past. It's about the present and the future. So let's go back in time. So the first libraries and archives that we know of came into being in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, the oldest ones about 4,000 before the Christian era, 4,000 years before the Christian era. And to a librarian, if you look at this image, you can just about kind of recognize your institution. You know, there are shelves, there's a shelving system, and the documents that were stored in that shelving system were actually on clay, marked in cuneiform script in a variety of ancient languages. But we know, because many of these, and actually an extraordinary number of these documents survive, that they were managed and organised carefully by people that we would now, or roles that we would now recognise as librarians and archivists. They have metadata, they were catalogued, they were classified, they were organised in very kind of careful, rigorous, intellectual ways. And so there is a kind of long tradition here. And one of the other interesting things about them is that those first libraries and archives were in temples, and the roles of librarian and archivist were sacred roles. You can all bow down before me at any moment during the lecture. And the British Museum had a wonderful exhibition in 2018 called I Am Ashurbanipal, and about the ruler of the Assyrian kingdom in the 7th century before the Christian era. And at the heart of that exhibition was a library. You can see it on the screen before you, which the curators of that exhibition, I think rather convincingly, claimed to be the earliest library that we know of that attempted to encompass the whole of human knowledge as it was understood at the time. And here it was actually, we know about this, and the reason that that show was on at the British Museum was because of an excavation undertaken in the middle of the 19th century by a British explorer, we would call him an archaeologist today, called Austin Henry Layard, and he excavated the royal palace of King Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, just outside of Mosul in modern-day Iraq, and found the royal library and the royal archives, and removed them essentially to London, with lots and lots of other stuff, with all sorts of contemporary questions about the ethics of that in terms of colonialism. But the fact is that they're there, they've been available for study, and scholars have been painstakingly studying those documents. There's recently been a fantastic book published about the Library of Ashurbanipal just a few months ago by Selina Wisnom, a scholar at the University of Leicester. I commend the book to you. But I think for our purposes today, one of the most interesting things that scholars have discovered about Ashurbanipal's library is that, well, there are two facts. One is that many of the texts were about the prediction of the future. So they're divination, astrology, astronomy. When is the best time to plant a crop? When is the best time to go to war? When is the best time to have a child? And so, again, knowledge is about the future and not the past. And the other interesting thing that we know from the correspondence that was excavated both at the time in the middle of the 19th century and subsequently is that Ashurbanipal was targeting libraries in neighbouring kingdoms, particularly Babylonia, because he knew that they had texts about these issues, prediction of the future, that he wanted for his own collection. And so he sent agents to seize those texts and bring them back to his own library. And so if you think of the control of knowledge, you're depriving your enemy of knowledge that helps them predict the future. So you're weakening them. At the same time, you're making yourself stronger because you're building your arsenal of knowledge. So hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that towards the end of the talk. And this is John Martin's wonderful depiction of the fall of Nineveh, the end of the Assyrian kingdom, because the palace of Nineveh was destroyed. The library was kind of covered by the ruins of the great city in those temples, and then recovered, two millennia later. If you think about other ancient libraries, you think, of course, of the Great Library of Alexandria, which classical authors regarded as being the greatest library of the ancient world. And we actually have a link to that library in one of our great treasures in the Bodleian, which is the earliest surviving manuscript of one of the foundational texts of modern mathematics, Euclid's Elements of Geometry, written in the 9th century in the Imperial Academy in Byzantium. But that text was written in the Great Library of Alexandria. So the library had a storehouse, a place where the knowledge was stored, mostly scrolls of papyrus, and then a building next door to it called the Museion, a temple of the Muses, where scholars gathered to access the treasures in the library. Scribes, scholars, and one of those was Euclid. But the contemporary view, the commonly held view of the Great Library of Alexandria is that it was destroyed in a great fire. And if you, I don't know if any of you watch Carl Sagan's great series Cosmos, the first episode of it, he says, if I had a time machine, the place that I would go back to would be the Great Library of Alexandria the day before the fire. And I would rescue all of this knowledge that went up in smoke, and we would keep it for society. Now, contemporary scholars now know that there was no such great conflagration. The library actually declined over centuries. It was founded in the 4th, 5th century before the Christian era, and by the 4th century of the Christian era, it had gone. And that, to me, is a sign of neglect. It stopped being an imperial a royal priority, it stopped being a thing of prestige, it stopped being a thing that got funding, and that funding declined to the point at which the library kind of disappeared. And if you go to Alexandria today, you know, there's no clear place where the library was. It had vanished. And so again, this idea of neglect we'll come back to later. So let's fast forward in time to the Reformation of the 16th century in Europe, and I took this photograph on the site of the great library of Glastonbury Abbey. In the cloisters of one of the great monastic houses of the Middle Ages, and the Abbey Church at Glastonbury was so big, the house was so wealthy that it was bigger than Canterbury Cathedral. So an extraordinary structure. And wonderfully, we have one of the surviving books from the library. That's on the right. It's an assemblage of texts from the 8th and 9th centuries that were collected by one of the abbots of Glastonbury Abbey, St Dunstan, who later became Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the great figures, one of the great intellectual figures of the 9th and 10th centuries. And some scholars argue that this is the earliest self-portrait in British art. So there you see St Dunstan kneeling at the foot of Christ. It's known as St Dunstan's class book. And on the left-hand side of the screen is a document from a 16th century archive, also in the Bodleian, the archive of a man called John Leland. And John Leland was commissioned by Henry VIII as a kind of super researcher to search the great libraries of England in the 1530s to help assemble texts that would support his attempt to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and to marry the beautiful courtier Anne Boleyn. And he needed information to help him with that argument, and later with the argument to divorce the English Church from papal authority. And Leland was a great scholar because he kept detailed records of the books that he looked at. And here are the books that he looked at in the library of Glastonbury Abbey. And elsewhere in the archive, we know how much he was looking forward to going to Glastonbury. And he wrote that when he was eventually admitted to the library by the abbot, John Whiting, who was an elderly Benedictine in his 80s, he said, "No sooner as I crossed the threshold of the library that I swooned at the mere sight of the great books." So he kind of lost himself for a moment. Didn't quite fall over, but he was on the verge of it. A great bibliophile. And you can see that the books that he looked at in the library, and at the bottom of that list you can see, it says Grammatica Uticis Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. And that's the book that he saw, probably in 1533. So one of about 2,000 books, probably. We don't know exactly how many in the library of Glastonbury Abbey on the eve of the Reformation in 1539. We know exactly what happened when the library was dissolved. There are detailed records, and John Whiting was accused of plundering the riches of the church and many other nasty things besides, and was dragged behind a cart up to Glastonbury Tor, where he was hung, drawn and quartered. The property of the abbey was distributed as an act of patronage by the king, and of the 2,000 books that were in the library, we only know of 69 that survive today. And this is one of them. So what happened to the rest? Well, they were destroyed. And they were torn up, sold. We don't know precisely what happened to them, but only 60 odd of the 2,000 survive. And similar things happened in this city and in this university. This is the original library of the university, the original central library of the university. You may know it as the Vaults Cafe. The room above it was begun in 1320 as the first university library. By the 1430s, it was full, and the great gift of the library by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the brother of Henry V, to the university meant that the university authorities needed to build a separate room to house the books they already had that had filled the room in the church with the new gift. And they built what you can walk around today as Duke Humphrey's Library in order to house the collection. But that library, that room, was visited in 1549 and 1550 by the commissioners of Edward VI in the most kind of extreme phase of the Protestant Reformation, and the books were destroyed. Again, the library was dismantled, the pages were torn out and sold to butter makers to wrap butter in, and pie makers to line pie dishes, and to bookbinders, to the local book trade, to strengthen the bindings of the new technology of print. And you can see some of those fragments from the medieval library that survive in the bindings of books in the Bodleian. And then several decades later, this man, Sir Thomas Bodley, came along. He had been he brought up in a Protestant family. His family, during the Catholic reign of Mary Tudor in the 1550s, had fled to the continent, and he'd been imbued with Protestant theology, but he regretted the destruction of knowledge in the previous generations, and vowed himself, coming back to Oxford, essentially as the bursar of Merton College, to renew the library, to rebuild it, to re-establish it. And he re-established it with preservation at its core. So the founding statutes of the library have preservation. The role of the library was to preserve knowledge, to protect it from the kinds of things that had happened in the previous generation. So here's this kind of human impulse to preserve and to keep knowledge. And so, the strong cupboards where the most great treasures were kept, you can still see them in the library. And this here brings us to Milton. This impulse to preserve knowledge has been something that has kind of entered almost the DNA of the institution. So John Milton, who this lecture is named after, was a great friend of my predecessor, the second librarian, John Rouse. I'm the 25th. And he gave the library a volume of his own pamphlets, his own publications, and hand wrote a poem in praise of the library, which he gave alongside these books to John Rouse. But of course, Milton was one of the signatories to the death warrant of Charles I, and when the monarchy was restored in 1660, the regicides were targeted by the royalists for essentially for censorship. And on two occasions in the 1660s and 1670s, the books of the regicides were ordered by royal decree to be gathered in the Bodleian's quadrangle and burned. And my predecessor, the fifth librarian, Thomas Hyde, hid the special copy of Milton's books and refused to give it up to the flames that were burning just outside the door of the Bodleian. And it must have been at some risk to himself. We still have the book, we still have the handwritten poem, but he hid it from the conflagration. Let's keep moving forward in time. Here is a character, Admiral Sir George Cockburn, who led a British expeditionary force to the United States of America in 1812. And I'd like you to focus on the backdrop to this fantastic mezzotint, which is the burning of Washington, D.C. Not something I was taught about when I did history. Not our finest hour. And we actually have an eyewitness account of the burning of Washington. So Washington was besieged, and in August 1814, the British Expeditionary Force, accusing locals of taking pot shots at them, entered the city. They found their way to the Capitol building, where the Library of Congress was housed, and they set they set the library on fire. And a Balliol chap, I'm a fellow of Balliol, George Gleig, wrote an account. He was in the British Army at the time, and he said, "It did not stop here. A noble library, several printing offices, and all the National Archives were likewise committed to the flames, which no doubt the property of government might better have been spared." And here you can see in a contemporary watercolour, you can see the smoke stains out of the windows of the Capitol building. This was the only stone-built building in Washington at the time. The news of the fire reached Thomas Jefferson, who obviously one of the architects of the American Revolution, of the American Constitution, one of the first presidents, and the owner of one of the, probably the greatest library in America at the time. And he had retired to Monticello, outside Washington in Virginia. The news reached him of the burning of the Library of Congress, and he wrote a letter to Washington newspaper saying, "This is outrageous, this is an act of barbarism by the British, and I'm going to offer my library to replace the 5,000 volumes that were burned." And so again, here's this impulse to preserve, to renew, to keep those stocks of knowledge. And eventually, it wasn't a gift, but he offered it at mates rates, and eventually Congress decided to buy 7,000 volumes to replace the burned books and to restart the Library of Congress. We'll go forward in time to the Holocaust, to World War II, and to the city of Vilnius, or Vilna in Lithuania, which was, on the eve of World War II, one of the great centres of Jewish civilization, of religion in Eastern Europe, a city famous for its learned rabbis, like the famous Vilna Gaon, but also a city full of libraries, like the Strashun Library, which had been bequeathed to the Jewish community in Vilnius by a wealthy Jewish businessman who was a bibliophile. And on the eve of World War II, it had a great library, a learned librarian, and a busy reading room. And there were other institutions in the city at the time, particularly an institution called YIVO, which was, had been founded in the middle of the 1920s as a place where the everyday life, the secular life of the Jewish communities of Central and Eastern Europe could be preserved, could be gathered and preserved, and ideas that were central to the culture of the Yiddish language rather than Hebrew could be preserved and celebrated. And the YIVO Institute collected all sorts of interesting documents, musical posters, medical records, all in the Yiddish language. But of course, the war on knowledge from the Nazi regime had begun in 1933 on the 10th of May with the mass burning of books organised, orchestrated by Goebbels in central Berlin in this great sacred site, just off Unter den Linden. And if you go there today, there's a very moving plaque, a kind of empty library in the kind of lower part of what is called Babelplatz today. And it's right opposite the Humboldt University, right opposite the State Library of Berlin. And that kind of war on knowledge became more organised as the 1930s moved into the 1940s, and after Operation Barbarossa unleashed the Nazi war machine on the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, alongside the stormtroopers came a kind of cultural stormtrooper. And these were led by the man on the left-hand side of your screen, called Alfred Rosenberg, one of the architects of anti-Semitism in Germany, who built an institute for the study of the Jewish question in Frankfurt. And in the institute was a library of Hebrew and Jewish books, including Hebrew and Yiddish materials. And these were collected by a librarian, Johannes Pohl, who's the person on the other image on the screen, who led an operational group that came behind the stormtroopers, and when the cities of Central and Eastern Europe were occupied, ghettos were formed, and his group would go into the ghettos and identify librarians and archivists who they would force to go through an exercise of identifying unique and important books in the libraries that the Nazis had seized. And this happened in Vilnius in 1941 and in 1942, and the group of Jewish librarians and archivists and scholars who were identified to take on this task were known as the Paper Brigade. And to any librarian, I don't know if there are librarians in the audience, but to any of you who work with a collection, to imagine yourself being forced at gunpoint to go into your collection and to choose materials that would go back to the Frankfurt Institute or to be destroyed in paper mills must have been a horrific thing to have done. And so the members of the Paper Brigade, and you can see them at work here, photographs taken by Pool's operational group, they began to smuggle books out of the ghetto because they would go back to the ghetto every evening. And they took pages, they hid them in their clothes, they persuaded the Nazis they needed furniture, and they hid documents in the aluminium tubing of the chairs and tables. They said, oh, we need paper in order to light the fires in the ghetto. And they smuggled thousands of books and documents out. Again, each time they did that, they risked their own lives. So again, this human impulse to preserve and protect knowledge at the risk of their own death. And they managed to do this. They hid books in underground in the ghetto, knowing that they might not survive themselves, but at least the knowledge of their community might endure. And unbeknownst to them, similar things were happening in other cities in Central and Eastern Europe. Here, this is a kind of a staged reconstruction of documents being recovered after the war in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, which are being hidden there by a group called Oyneg Szabes, led by an extraordinary man called Emanuel Ringelblum, who preserved documents from the Warsaw Ghetto to bear witness to the life that that community had in the ghetto itself. And they hid them in milk canisters and metal boxes, and 2 of the 3 troves that they hid have been recovered, and you can see them in Warsaw today. But the extraordinary thing is that the documents that had been preserved in the Vilna ghetto by the Paper Brigade, they survived. The Nazis were pushed out by the Soviet army. Some of the members of the Paper Brigade escaped, avoided the mass murder of the occupants of the ghetto, and pushed the Nazis out. And but also the documents that had got to Frankfurt, to Rosenberg's perverted research institute, they also survived. And they were overrun, that institute was overrun by American forces in 1945, and they began an enormous process of trying to find the heirs, the people, the rightful owners of those documents. And they discovered that the YIVO Institute had a tiny office in New York. And here is the staff of the YIVO office in New York receiving crate after crate after crate of documents from the YIVO Institute, the Strashun Library, and the other libraries of Vilnius in New York in the late 1940s. And the YIVO Institute is now a thriving institution. You can see those documents beautifully organized in the shelves of 9th Street. But the extraordinary thing is that the documents saved by the Paper Brigade in Vilnius, and recovered, the YIVO Institute in the city was restarted after the Nazis were pushed out. But this time they fell foul of communist ideology. And after a couple of years, the communists said, these are all anti-communist documents, and they sent them to the paper mills for pulping. But this time, a Lithuanian librarian, here he is, Antanas Ulpis, discovered what was happening, went to the paper mills and drove the trucks back to the city. And he was in charge of an outpost of the National Library in a former church, and he hid the documents among all the kind of Lithuanian literature in this outpost of the National Library, including hiding documents in the organ pipes. And he kept it a secret until 1989. And after that, today, these documents are being digitized by the YIVO Institute in New York and the National Library of Lithuania. I'd like to kind of finish this part of the talk with a more recent attack on knowledge. This is the 1990s. This is the National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo, which was targeted on the 25th of August 1992 with incendiary shells by the Serb forces who were besieging the city. No other buildings were targeted this day. This was a deliberate attack on the National Library, which contained books in Hebrew, Jewish books, Muslim books, and Christian books. So this kind of multicultural collection was what the Serbs wanted to eradicate. And not only did they fire incendiary shells, but the librarians and firefighters who tried to rescue collections from the burning building were targeted by snipers. And one of the librarians, Ada Butarovic, was murdered by the snipers that day. And this heralded a whole range of attacks on libraries and archives in Bosnia and Kosovo over the coming years, including targeting land registries. So the Serbs wanted to eradicate any record that Muslims owned property in Bosnia or Kosovo. And in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague, Slobodan Milosevic and Ratko Mladic were part of their indictment was for the destruction of libraries and archives. Okay, so what's happened since? What's happening now? Well, in 2021, when the Taliban seized control of Afghanistan again, one of the first things they did was to attack libraries. Some of them very small libraries, very humble institutions, including one focused on young women in Afghanistan, was destroyed. It was recorded on video by the Taliban and shared on social media. And then, of course, since February 2023, we've seen, and I wrote about it in the Atlantic, widespread attacks on libraries in Ukraine. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But we also see a different kind of attempts to control knowledge. And here's a group of individuals at the inauguration, the second inauguration of President Trump. These are the tech titans. These are what our Oxford colleague Timothy Garton-Ash calls the private superpowers. And it's been interesting to see just how close they've come to the presidency and how much that link between the private superpowers and political control has come closer and closer and tighter and tighter. And this has benefited both parties, both in terms of releasing the controls and the regulation on the operations of the big social media platforms, which I argue are part of our kind of contemporary archives, in effect. Knowledge platforms, which you cannot understand the world in which we live unless you understand what's been going on social media. But we also see it at a micro level with the use of encrypted and self-deleting communication technologies like WhatsApp, Signal, by politicians, senior civil servants, and I wrote an op-ed back in 2020 for the FT on the dangers of relying on that as a medium of forming government policy, which really should be under the auspices of the 1958 Public Records Act, so I argued in the piece, and therefore under the control of the information regime overseen by the Information Commissioner. Of course, that was ignored, despite writing to the Culture Secretary at the time and the Cabinet Secretary. But of course, eventually, the WhatsApp messages about Partygate brought the Johnson administration down. And again, we saw social media. I mean, really all that Trump needed in his first presidency was an iPhone and a Twitter account. But he was want to post messages in the early hours of the morning, and eventually his staff would catch up and delete a number of his posts. But here's this thing about that human impulse to preserve knowledge. So there has been an emerging trend of what I call activist archivists, groups who want to protect that knowledge, to keep it for public accountability. And so a group called FactBase set up automatic screenshotting. So every time Trump posted a tweet, it would be captured and made available publicly on the FactBase website, including all the ones that subsequently got deleted. And of course, you think of Facebook, you know, archiving is not in the business model of the big social media organizations. But there are efforts to preserve this kind of data. So the National Library of New Zealand have had a project where asking New Zealanders to donate their Facebook archives. And Twitter, the Library of Congress had for a time a big project to preserve Twitter. They stopped doing that after a few years. But you know, at the time that that Musk took over Twitter, there were concerns about its future. And then we've also seen with the rise of AI and the kind of trawling of the internet to form the basis of the large language models, that this kind of public knowledge is being enclosed in more and more concerning ways, including what's happening at the moment with health information. And for full disclosure, of course, Oxford has a collaboration with OpenAI. The Bodleian has a component of it with a pilot project at the moment where we're considering how we could and should engage with the world of the large language models. And there's no, we'll come to a view when our pilot project comes to an end. And going back to this idea of neglect and the demise of the Great Library of Alexandria, I wrote a piece about a year ago in Prospect magazine about it's not a war on public libraries, but it's been a neglect, a kind of state-level neglect of the public library system. This year is the 175th anniversary of the 1850 Public Libraries Act that allowed local authorities to raise a penny on the rates to establish a free public library. An extraordinary investment in the intellectual capital of everyone, an inclusive system that allowed individuals to flourish, to take their own futures in their own hands. And in the last 10 or 12 years, we've lost over 1,000 public libraries in this country. So an extraordinary act of neglect. And in America, the public library system is under attack in a different way, and that's through censorship. That's through limiting the range and the type of knowledge that can be shared on the shelves of public libraries and school libraries in particular. And this again is ideologically and politically motivated. And it's got so bad that even Banned Books Week is being banned in some states of America at the moment. And as America sneezes, Britain sometimes catches cold, and there is kind of growing evidence that public libraries in this country, and I was in Ireland over the last couple of days talking to librarians there, and the public library system there is also being similarly challenged. And this, last August we saw, a flagship of the Liverpool public library system at Spello actually targeted for and set on fire because it had a number of services focused on immigrant communities. And going back to the theme of neglect, in 2011, the website of the Supreme Court, so this is not a formal library or archive, but it's kind of public knowledge, the legal decisions of the highest court in America. In 2011, the Harvard Law Library did a survey of the Supreme Court website and found that 40% of the web links were broken. So how important is it for an open democratic society to have knowledge, to have the public the ability to access the laws of the land? That wasn't happening. And that was an act of neglect. And similarly, the cyber attack on the British Library is another kind of symbol of that. And even more kind of current, we see that that sort of ideologically driven control of knowledge is happening in a variety of other spheres at the moment. For example, stopping scientists from publishing in certain journals. And we don't have time, this would be another lecture entirely to think about what is happening to the higher education system in America at the moment. And to the museums, I have the museums here in my group, and in the Smithsonian and other museums are also finding similar assaults on their ability. And things have got worse in the last few weeks with the sacking of the Librarian of Congress in early May. I actually invited her to come and speak to us in the Bodleian in March, and she declined the invitation she accepted the invitation and said 4 days before the event that it was too tense to leave the city, and that proved unfortunately to be the case. And if you think about, again, this kind of control of knowledge and Derrida's quote at the front, and you think of what was found in the guest bathroom at Mar-a-Lago after Trump's first presidency ended, boxes and boxes of classified documents. And then we see that not only is the archivist in the United States being sacked and replaced by Marco Rubio. By the way, the Librarian of Congress was replaced by the lawyer who defended Trump against Stormy Daniels. That's now the head of the largest library in the world. And what's happened more recently, I just screenshotted this yesterday, is that the committee that advises the government, the National Archives, on the classification and declassification of documents, all of the members have been sacked. So there is now no committee that oversees the process of declassifying government documents in America. And the whole kind of wave of deletions of the websites of public knowledge in the federal government, I have written about with my colleague Nana Thilstrup, who's an academic at the University of Copenhagen, in the New York Times last month. And I think it reminds me of Orwell's 1984, what is happening. So the Centre for Disease Control, its website, which had a whole swathes of public information on it, 108,000 pages were deleted in February. So I am going to finish now, and hopefully a reminder that the role of libraries and archives playing, I call them the infrastructure of democracy. And there are 5 kind of arguments that I make for why this is the case. The first is a kind of obvious one. They're educational institutions. You saw that in the 1850 Public Libraries Act. But if you think of Rawls's arguments in his theory of justice and political liberalism around the importance of an educated population in being able to interact with the institutions of democracy. But we think of them, you know, supplying information to our immediate community of students, but being, in the past, libraries have had profoundly social improvement roles. You think of, you know, there's a very moving letter that Sylvia Pankhurst wrote to the British Museum when it still had the what's now the British Library under its auspices, saying that what she wanted to access is information about the employment of women. And today, in the Bodleian, my colleagues work with groups from schools which don't normally send their pupils to apply to Oxford, to give them access to, here in this case, one of the original copies of Magna Carta. And you think of other reasons why knowledge, in this case sometimes very boring books, are of great social importance. So these are screenshots from the film Spotlight. I don't know if any of you saw it, about investigative journalists in Boston who uncovered child sexual abuse by priests in the Catholic Church in the city. And they were able to track the movement of those individuals by looking at outdated, long since outmoded copies of parish newspapers, clerical directories and so on, and they were able to match the movement as priests were moved from diocese to diocese, from parish to parish. And those documents were kept in the stacks of the Boston Public Library, and they were able to be used to bring those people to justice. Archives in particular are places where the rights of citizens are preserved. That image was taken in the Stasi archives in East Berlin, where in 1989 German citizens overtook Stasi headquarters in order to stop the Stasi destroying their own the documents, the records of their own surveillance activities. In an age of misinformation and disinformation, libraries and archives are reference points for facts and truth. And one incident came to us, to the Bodleian, a few years ago, where an alumnus of the university in India found that a copy of his thesis had been doctored and manipulated to present political views that he didn't hold on a very hot topic, the relationship between Muslims and Hindus in India. And he reached out to us and we went back. We preserved the original and we digitized that and made it available online, but we were able to show that the doctored version did not represent his ideas because we had the source of truth. And it reminds us of course, of the president of Magdalen, Martin Ralph, who advised his students to always verify your references. And you can only do that if you've preserved the knowledge in the first place. And that's the role of archives and libraries in our world today, as places where trusted knowledge can be found. And finally, you think of the role of libraries and archives as preserving the identity of communities. And you only need to look at what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, with hundreds of libraries being attacked, huge numbers of books being destroyed, public libraries, university libraries, special libraries. But again, the librarians are responding in extraordinary ways to protect their community, in this case, turning an underground library into a bomb shelter with books attached. And finally, libraries bring a diversity of knowledge, and in our world today, where we need to have, I think for a democratic and open, pluralistic society, our citizens to have access to different ideas, sometimes challenging ideas, but a place where different knowledge can be accessed kind of safely. And that is what is being challenged in America at the moment. But again, there is an extraordinary fight back. Librarians are organising themselves, they are placing legal challenges, they are reversing some of these decisions. Most recently, the bizarre removal of a few hundred books from the Pentagon libraries, including our beloved colleague here, Margaret Macmillan's books. Astonishing to think that she's on that censored list. And again, institutions like the Brooklyn Public Library digitising books on those banned book lists and making them available online to the states where citizens can't access that knowledge. So, although these are very challenging times, there is still that human impulse to preserve knowledge, and it's happening all the time in our libraries and archives. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Richard, for that extraordinarily sobering talk. I must say that if the archive is power, the ability to explain the archive and bring it to life, and make people want to preserve it is also extremely powerful and important. So thank you very much. Richard has said he will take a few questions. So I see a hand shoot up here. Well, if you can just wait for the microphone, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very fascinating and also deeply worrying talk. I just wanted to ask a little bit, you've talked mostly about kind of the supply side and ensuring that we have this knowledge available to us and that people could access it. But I think there's also a question about the demand side, which is about people being distracted on their phones, not necessarily having the attention spans to read books, of great depth anymore. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on that. Is should we be worried about technology taking away our attention spans, or are you?
Yeah, I mean that's a slightly different topic to the one that I've been talking about, but it's an important one, and thank you for raising it. I think it is real. I think there is signs that people are being distracted. There is some evidence of attention spans lowering, our ability to close read, to read for long periods of time, changing. But I'm encouraged by several things that's going on. One is just walking into libraries, not just the bod, where you may have done that. The college libraries, they're full, they're busy. People are concentrating hard in them. Also, the book trade continues to actually survive quite well in the many challenges, the many other opportunities people have to kind of entertain and inform themselves. Actually, the book trade, both in digital and physical books, continues to hold up actually really strongly. And we found that in the pandemic in particular. And I think that the kind of reading habits or the kind of information habits of human beings have changed over time, and they continue to change. I'm encouraged actually by podcasting, because that's, in a way, that's kind of long form, slow information, deep, sometimes actually, deep amounts of knowledge are transmitted, and that's become a huge phenomenon, hugely popular, and it's not an alternative often to books, it's an adjunct to them. It helps kind of explain, it encourages people to go and read, or if you've read something, it kind of expands your kind of worldview of the stuff you've been reading about. So I think I'm not too, I'm worried about it, but I'm not depressed about it, if you like.
Does the Bodleian preserve podcasts?
We do preserve some podcasts, actually, probably not as extensively as we should do, but it comes under the 2013 legal deposit regulations, which allow us, which we do collaboratively with the other copyright libraries in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, which is to archive the whole of the UK web domain, and coming with that are our podcasts as well.
I've got two more hands right at the front, and then we'll move back up to the back. Yes.
Shall I do first? No, I insist. I was struck by your example of the forged defill thesis, where you had the true copy, which could adjudicate. Are there examples of where some bad actor has tried to forge the record, which is stored in the so-called trusted resource in the official library? And also, now that more information is stored digitally, that seems to be easier for somebody to alter. So does that create problems now that more of our records are digital?
I don't think we've had experience of that ourselves. I think it becomes more of a risk. And I think it's where we need the kind of the knowledge infrastructure that we provide both has to prevent that from happening, but also to constantly point back to the source of truth. So we have monitoring regimes which can detect when digital information that we have has been tampered with. We can prove if it has been. But also where we have persistent identifiers which constantly point back to the, if you like, the master copy that we provide online. And then in the case of older theses, we actually have the print copy as well, which we did with that one. So we had a kind of double source of truth, if you like. But as what happened to the British Library showed that we need to invest in that knowledge infrastructure as a nation in order to protect ourselves against bad actors.
Thank you for the. Is this on?
Yes,
thank you for
yes.
this. So I'm struck by the sort of relatively ephemeral nature of the human lifespan and how that's linked to the concept of the subaltern by Spivak. And we have this idea of tradition, of knowledge passed down through generations, which is unseen capital. How can we ensure that on the flip side of things, with the sort of dead internet theory that's coming up with the sort of flooding of the internet with all AI, how can we sort of, I don't know, preserve human knowledge to predict the future in a way that LLMs can't?
So that's a very interesting, quite a big question, and one that we've been sort of exploring. We have a pilot project at the moment called the Algorithmic Archive, which is looking at how we can preserve large-scale online knowledge sources like social media. And we had a recent kind of event where we asked a number of kind of experts to come and help us form our kind of policy on this. And some of that was actually that we should be preserving some of the slop, as it's called, online, just so that we can see what is happening in the online space. But it's where curation, that kind of core library and archival skill comes into play, where you're able to detect and select valuable information to be preserved when you might have a whole range of information that's not valuable or doesn't have long-term research value or societal value.
Taste, as it were.
Sorry?
Taste, as it were.
You can call it taste. Sometimes it's, and again, the Bodleian has a great tradition of actually targeting information that others would, that we wanted to refute. So, the Bodleian was set up as a kind of a Protestant information resource. But we were deliberately collecting Catholic theology and philosophy so that our scholars in Oxford could argue against it, as it were. So it was quite, but we also used the Roman Catholic Index as a kind of shopping list.
There's a hand here, and then there at the back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the tech titans and their increasing influence in politics and information. We're seeing, as the LLMs need large swaths of information to be trained on, large tech companies are increasingly pushing for things to become open source so that they can train their models on it. You started the lecture by saying that power is controlling the archive. When we all have access to the largest archive in human history with the internet, but a select few group of people have the ability to harvest it to train these powerful machines, how do you perceive that balance of power, and like what does that mean for the future of archives and stuff?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think it's one of the great kind of questions of this moment at time, one that we're kind of grappling with. And it's quite interesting. I saw a graph recently about the domains that are most heavily crawled by an organisation called Common Crawl, which is the organisation which sort of sucks data off the internet and sells it back to the large language models. And it's very interesting to see the Oxford domain is very, very high in this list. So it's either because we have an enormous sprawling website, or because we're very good at search engine optimization, or because Common Crawl tweaks the algorithm because they want as much Oxford data in their training set as possible. I think it's probably a mixture of all three. But it does pose a challenge to us, which is, on the one hand, generative AI is so heavily used now that it might be a societal benefit for Oxford to populate the training set with trusted information, high quality information, because the outputs of generative AI would be better with that information in it rather than not in it. But on the other hand, our doctoral theses are getting ripped off by commercial, aggressively capitalist for-profit organizations. And is that a good thing for us to be giving that stuff for free? And so that's one of the questions which we as an academic community are going to have to come to a view on pretty soon, I think.
Well, thank you very much for that talk, and thank you for saying that was a brilliant question, because that was my question. But I was going to say it from a different perspective, which is the firing of the Librarian of Congress was followed soon thereafter by the head of the Copyright Office, was also fired thereafter. She was one of my college friends. And the whole reason is thought to be so that the gurus of AI can have access to all the materials of the Library of Congress without them putting brakes on it. And again, my question was really about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to have all that information available to us, or is it really too much of a loss of control?
Well, most of the Library of Congress's website and digitized material is public domain anyway. So in theory, it's been available for anyone to have access to anyway. But I think what the role of generative AI and the large language models has kind of changed the dynamic there. And I think we still have to kind of, I think there are two ways of looking at it. And I think I'm not clear in my own mind what is the right kind of way to think about it. And I think possibly there are two ways to think about it. One is material that is in the public domain, digitized books from the 19th century. It might be that you think differently about that than we might think about recent doctoral theses, where the authors are still alive. So that's one way I'm beginning to kind of think about this. And there's also been recently some interesting ideas about establishing a license to crawl and actually levying charges on those who do the crawling, and those charges might come back to public goods in some way or other. So that's quite an interesting idea, but I don't see that being promulgated anytime soon in the current presidential regime in America.
Okay, I've got one more hand, and then I'm going to draw it to a close. So this is the last question. Yes. Sorry, can you just wait for the microphone? Thank you.
I'm going to take this back down to the very particular. I'm very worried about the very things that you showed in the first half of your presentation, in that materials from institutions that have been threatened, Columbia or Harvard, or from the Library of Congress, could end up being taken out and destroyed or sold into private hands if the universities need money. We could think about the Royal College of Physicians was approached by Bonhams to buy their Chaucer when they needed money. But so is there a call for a rescue, a proactive rescue of books from these threatened institutions? And if there is there maybe like a long-term loan program or something that other institutions that are preserving books might partner with the institutions under threat?
So, I mean, theoretically, that's certainly possible. A number of library organisations have both formal and informal kind of partnership arrangements where, particularly if unique materials come up for sale, that other libraries will be given the chance to acquire them. I think what's happening at the moment is in the digital space, where there are organisations, one called datarescue.org, which is has been preserving some of the public information on the federal, like the Centres for Disease Control website. The Max Planck Institutes are now hosting a whole series of environmental data that's been deleted from the federal government websites. And that was, datarescue.org was a kind of middle actor, a bit of middleware, if you like, between that act of deletion where they took the data before it went offline and were able to then to pass it on to the Max Planck Institutes where they are now hosting it. I think the real worry is that the actual data collecting isn't now happening.
Okay, well, I think Richard has deserved the drink, which I will now offer him. So I'm going to draw this to an end. We now have 2 more talks left in our public talk series for this academic year. Next week we have Elisa Morguera. Next week is a week where there will be a number of events in Oxford about climate change, and Elisa is the UN Special Rapporteur on climate change and human rights. So we will be in conversation about the link between those 2 subjects. And then the week after that is our Sanctuary lecture, and Marina Warner will be talking about the idea of home. So I hope you'll join us for those if you would like to. But in the meantime, thank you, Richard, for not only curating our archive, but advocating for it. It's extremely important and enormously skilled and entertaining the way you do it. So everyone should go and buy a copy of Richard's book, which came out in the pandemic, and so that's really unfair. But yes, thank you very much for delivering this year's Milton Lecture.
Thank you.